welcome back to Kinetic Image and Text. I'm Jeremy, and this is going to be the last section where we start looking at some of the core design principles relating to moving type when you're working in motion design. It has been quite a detailed series, but it's really important, I think, to understand all the opportunities that you have when you move text. Sometimes it's about isolating to really understand the possibilities. So that's what we've tried to do by giving you this framework. Really isolate different actions that you can take as a way to maybe not come up with your immediate concept, but to tweak it to make it more expressive and more interesting. So if something is kind of functioning but not really feeling like it's a refined design piece, going to this framework can be really helpful because it can kind of make you understand how you could approach some of the elements really differently without having to go wild with filters or anything like that, but just really think of, I guess, this idea of choreography with the way that your type works and just realizing it is a very different game playing with type on a page and on a screen. So this particular lecture and the following one is all about time. So this idea that you have changes over a period to typography. So it's not set in stone what the type is. This allows for so much opportunity to really take the reader through an experience. And that's something that's not possible when you're dealing with printed type. This idea of actually having a journey with the communication with the type itself. So there's a lot to take in, but I think you'll find it a really good way to have something to come back to maybe as you're developing your project, or even starting when you're developing your concept, thinking, okay, I'm going to try this approach when I communicate. I don't want to just have standard transitions, type appearing and almost being static, and that's all I'm going to do with it. And we've got lots of examples here. Again, we've isolated a particular principle and have a very specific example. Some of them are very straightforward, but they're just good to understand the vocabulary, the design vocabulary you have when you're working with moving type. And these are good things to go back to, like I said, because it will give you some directions you can go if you just feel things are a little flat and you just want to add just a bit more spark to your work. So in terms of this week, we've got 2 micro lectures that are about motion-based type design principles and dealing with this idea of time. And because it is the big game changer with typography, when you're dealing with motion-based design, that's why we actually are having 2 micro lectures just focusing on design principles to do with time. I've also got another micro lecture, which is an introduction to videography. A lot of you will be doing live footage as part of your assessment, and I understand that a lot of people have come from a background where you haven't studied film or anything like that, or video production, so it's a bit of a 101 to get you started. A lot of people are really visually literate in terms of filming though, because we all do filming with our mobile phone. Most of us have Instagrams and so forth where we're putting footage up, and we're doing that on Facebook and stuff like that, or wherever we're posting on our socials. So I'm aware that a lot of people have already developed a strong eye, but this particular micro lecture is gathering a whole lot. It's a bit of a mashup, gathering a whole lot of tips to help you get started, just to feel that little bit more confident as you go off and start filming, if that's what you're going to do for assessment 1. You had a great tutorial this week, which was all about developing assessment 1. So I hope that you felt that it was, it's all coming together and you have a strong sense of where you're going. Certainly you've got the Easter break, and then we're going to come back and really, push forward with your work. And I am actually going to be putting lots of resources over the Easter break online. I'm aware that people are going in different directions with the assessment, so I'm putting a real assortment of stuff online. And the idea is for you to just have a look at it all and then see which ones are most relevant to your assessment and the sort of skills that you need to produce it. And then you just kind of look at those in detail. There's no expectation that you're going to take on board and try to learn everything at this stage. It is really about going in the direction of your project and working out what's needed for that. Okay, so what these 2 micro lectures are doing are just filling in this last bit, second page of the framework that we've got. I'm using this kind of 2-pager as just a thing to remind you of some of the things to think about. So it is something you can refer back to as you're designing, especially maybe when you're editing, but also when you're conceptualizing things and storyboarding things, to just check that you are going in the most effective direction as possible. If something is a bit too kind of straightforward in terms of the way I refer to it on the framework. It might be worth going back to the lecture series, but hopefully a lot of these will prompt some of the key points from this series of micro lectures. And here it is, we're looking at time now. So this is, I think, probably the most exciting area of designing in motion design, because it's bringing in new ideas. When we dealt with space, that was interesting. A lot of the stuff to do with type, we've already kind of understood, but we're looking at it slightly differently, and there's different constraints and needs with designing for a screen as opposed to paper, as I sort of talked about in the micro lecture. But really, time is linked to kinetics, and we are kinetic image and text. So this is at the center of this particular unit, these next two micro lectures. So kinetics are actions or arrangements that produce change or imply the motion of objects. So we're just looking at the idea of implying or creating change to type as it appears on the screen. And the areas that we kind of are going to explore with kinetic design, three key areas where we can play with the idea of direction, which is the course or line of movement of the type, the orientation of the type, it's the directional position of the baseline of type where most letters sit, and we look at this idea of rotation as well, the movement around an anchor point, which is the center of rotation. So there's all these different ways. I keep talking about the choreography of type. When we work on this canvas, it's very much like we've got dancers dancing around, and we want to make it dynamic and engaging because there is the expectation of movement, but we also need to make sure it functions and readers or viewers can follow the communication when we're playing around with type, especially if there's a lot happening, like in a lyric video, for instance. So in terms of direction and orientation, that can be horizontal, vertical, diagonal, circular, advancing, or receding, which is all well and good when I put it in a sentence like that, but this is where visual examples are really important, and that's why I've done this with this particular part of the lecture series, showing lots of examples to really clarify what the impact is of using some of these approaches. So direction, orientation, and rotation can either occur on the two-dimensional frame plane, the X and Y axis, or spatially on an apparently three-dimensional plane, advancing or receding on the X axis. So again, it's this idea of working with space and type operating in this really dynamic way, but we can actually, in a two-dimensional space, create the same sort of feeling that we can create with three-dimensional type. What I'm going to do is look at how these different possibilities, direction, orientation, and all these elements actually work, and how it affects the way we read, and how it can make reading a bit more interesting because it's a little bit more unconventional. And that's where it's worth thinking about breaking away from the traditional way that text operates on a page when you're working on a screen. We're going to use the word, the sentence, the quick brown fox jumped over the lazy dog, which I don't know if you know, that's got every letter of the alphabet, which is why it's often used for a demonstration sentence. But we're going to look at that and how it operates in different ways. So firstly, I'm going to look at using direction where it's horizontal and orientation is horizontal. And then we're going to look at direction where it's vertical and the orientation is horizontal. So I think with those two examples, it's really apparent that the vertical one is, more interesting as a viewer, and it's still very legible, even though we're seeing a full sentence being revealed to ourselves. But the horizontal follows, it's kind of like almost too slow because we already know how it's going to appear. It's like a page. It feels like we're just looking at an animated page. Whereas with the second one, it's a little bit more unexpected, but very easy to read. So it actually works as a bit more of an engaging piece. And that's what I'm wanting to look at in these next two examples, where we sort of change the way that the text is presented in terms of how we're used to seeing it in print even more, but you'll find that it's still engaging and readable, but it's actually, it works in a more kind of dynamic way. So firstly, we're going to look at direction being vertical and then the orientation vertical. And then we're actually going to start seeing something even more interesting, because many kind of different approaches are being used in terms of direction and orientation. It's horizontal direction and an orientation that's vertical. So type is coming from different angles, and it's actually really interesting. So let's even mix it up further by playing with the fact that type can be diagonal as well when it appears, and in terms of direction and orientation. So the way it appears and also the way it sits. Uh, Firstly, we're going to look at one where we're using the same kind of diagonal lines, and then we're actually going to start playing with different diagonal lines in the second one, and you'll see it makes for a really interesting resting composition. And again, it's this evolution of what you can do in terms of this very, sort of long sentence, but it's still very readable, but it can really, again, coming back to this idea of choreography, it can all of a sudden be a lot more visually engaging and really take us on a bit of a journey. And again, taking us into an even more experimental area, I want to play around with this idea that direction can be circular in terms of how text appears. The orientation of the text can also be circular. And this is particularly appropriate, I think, for this statement, this sentence, because of the fact that there's action in it and there's jumping and so forth. So it kind of works. Not necessarily an approach that's going to work in a lot of contexts, but you can see how playful it is when we start using orientation and direction in an even more unexpected sort of different sort of way in terms of paths, rather than just very linear directions. So now let's look also at this idea of playing with advancing and receding text and see the sort of impact it also has on this particular statement. It's interesting because some words it kind of works for, but it actually seems very stationary after that quite dynamic piece that we just looked at. So you can sort of see how different effects can work in different ways. You have to make choices. You can't have too many effects in one sequence, but it might be that you animate different words in different ways using all of these different approaches that I'm showing in a way that's appropriate. And obviously it's in editing that you're able to then evaluate just, is this too much? Should I, take it back a little bit or not? A lot of tweaking happens in editing when you're dealing with motion-based type, because as much as we can conceptualize things on a storyboard, think something's going to work, when we actually watch it in real time, that's when we really have to think about, refining it a bit, and that's all about editing things. Okay, and just to show a different way to approach things, we can also play with this idea of just random design and look at the impact of working with direction in a very random way and how that works with the sentence as well. Okay, so we looked at the idea of playing with direction, where the direction of the type is when it appears, and also the orientation of the type, so where it's positioned on the screen. Now we're going to look at the idea of, with kinetics, actually rotating type as well. So here's a really straightforward example showing the different way that you can utilize anchor point to actually rotate type, and the difference in terms of speed and so forth when you do it. Let's look at some more rotation now. And here's an example of 3D type rotating on the vertical and horizontal axis, which is effective. But I actually really like this idea of using random rotation. You can see the energy that can come with that, and that's in the second example here. And it's not about it necessarily being this traditional 3D type. Okay, so moving on from direction, orientation, rotation, these key areas that you can move your type across the screen and make it kind of come alive. I also wanted to look now at the way that different words can be in relation to each other on the screen, and how we can use a whole lot of different design principles in relation to proximity to kind of have quite a distinct effect with what we do. So proximity is the distance between letters, words, and lines of type created by altering the kerning, tracking, and leading. So even though we've kind of worked with kerning, tracking, and leading before, we've never had this opportunity to alter it over time to the type that we've got. It's always that it's set in stone and it's designed to just be read as is. Whereas here we can play with this idea of dynamic kerning, dynamic tracking, dynamic leading, and playing with all these different distances. So importantly, established optically measured parameters for good proximity remain important for legibility and moving type on the screen. So we have to think about these in terms of practical context, but we can actually play with them, especially after they've been read, or as a way to get attention and then allow them to be read. So interesting visual relationships and enhancements of content can occur when kerning, letter spacing, and leading are really set in motion. Indeed, the specific definition of a word and meaning or of a phrase can actually be supported by us playing with proximity. This is where the type can become more expressive, and it doesn't have to be about color or changing shape. It's simply the way we use proximity. We create more expression and reinforce the meaning of our communication piece. So let's look at some examples that show this. We're going to apply it to this particular phrase in this case. Curiosity is one of the permanent and certain characteristics of a vigorous intellect. Okay, another quite long sentence, so it's important that the viewer is able to follow the whole thing so they understand it. The meaning of it is quite complex as well, so really important that legibility is there, even though we're being quite experimental with the way that we're presenting type. We're going to also try to emphasize the meaning by changing proximity, and I think you'll find with some of the examples, some are more effective in doing this than others. So let's look at this first one where I'm altering leading and tracking as the sentence appears. Okay, now let's look at using it in terms of kerning and playing with this within one specific part of the sequence. And you can see it's really trying to add meaning to it. It's debatable whether it's effective or not, but it's used on a particular word to kind of play with what's being said. And this is with a different statement. So altering proximity here can be conducive to dialogue when the designer is attempting to capture the voice and emotion of the words being spoken. And it is something that we often see in lyric videos or when we've got large quotes, and you would have done it in your quote activity quite possibly, where you're trying to express sections of the text quite literally, and we play with the way that the words are being said and what the words mean. And so this is a subtle way because it doesn't require, doing anything that unique to the motion context. It's just playing around with some simple ideas of kerning, leading, and tracking that we're actually familiar with from print. So let's look at this playing with kerning. Moving on from that example, I want to then look at not just the idea of proximity, but sequential proximity. And this is really important when you're delivering large chunks of text, and it could be an entire song, the lyrics of the song. It's about the sequence working in a way that's predictable but also, engaging, um, and it's easy to follow. So we are not showing all the text at the same time. So there's a proximity. We keep text kind of close to where previous text appeared when we reveal the next bit of text. So it is easy to follow with the eye. So moving type requires another delineation, which is called sequential proximity. Effective and appropriate sequential proximity ensures that the appearance of each word in the text appears in the exact or relatively close vicinity of the word which preceded it, and that's where it ensures legibility. And it's particularly important in designing for films in the cinema because the screen is so big, so it is actually quite difficult to follow text if it's jumping all over the screen. It needs to kind of be, in a close proximity when it's appearing in a sequence. On a mobile phone, if you're just designing something specifically for the mobile phone, not so much because you don't have as big a space to play with and a bigger range of spaces for someone to move and look in when they're looking at a screen. But still, it's worth considering designing with sequential proximity, whatever the context. We've got two examples here that use the curiosity phase again to demonstrate sequential proximity being used in transitions. First one is where it's just appearing to the left, and the second one is with the center. So the left one is sort of following our reading approach. I think that the centered one is probably more interesting. It's more unique to this context, but perhaps a little bit more difficult for us to remember what it is that we're seeing revealed and follow the sentence. Okay, so two very straightforward examples, but showing you how when you transition, there's different ways to think of it. You can play with the idea of it being flush left, flush right, centered. All of these things mix it up, and it's about the context of what you're creating. So even if you were to just do a title sequence, you can consider it doesn't have to all be in the same way that that things appear. You can play with things. So in terms of screen title sequences, you can see here just the way that text might appear with people's names and so forth. There's a few different options you can consider and think about in terms of how you're wanting to create a mood, which might be better. Certainly the centered approach gives a really kind of drawing in of the viewer, whereas the other one, where it's flush left, seems to be more functional. So again, think of the drama and the impact that you're trying to create with the text. So in terms of looking at this idea of sequential proximity, the intent really needs to be to allow the eye of the audience to follow a consistent path and create a visual flow. So a long bit of information can be processed and completely understood. The worst thing you can do is confuse the viewer. But then you don't want to make it so straightforward and obvious that they're not engaged. So now we're actually going to go back to some of the principles and approaches we looked at the beginning of this micro lecture, where we played with direction, and mix this with the idea of transitional changes and sequences appearing, and just look at how they can operate together. It's important to note that with all these possibilities, the designer must bear in mind how their culture reads and try not to alter that too much. The English language reads from left to right and from top to bottom. We should not present type that diverges too radically from this, and I think this is why it's important to look at some of my examples, because you realise you can really play with composition and where things are appearing and break the traditional way that we're doing things, but there are limitations to it, and certainly we have to take on board the way that we're expecting something to be, but also it can be that we want to play with that as well. So let's look at sequential proximity where we're just working with direction, and so the sequence is appearing in terms of a direction. And the second example, we're going to look at transition being applied as well as the use of direction and how that operates with this sentence. So with that particular example, we can see that there was a real sensitivity to the reading convention in the way that the text appeared. So the learning there is that words shouldn't really appear in random locations on a screen, as it can make it difficult for the eye of the audience to follow text, and that can cause disorientation and impair legibility. The problem of reading, such as sequence, actually increases as the physical size of the screen increases, which I said, as in film projection instead of smartphone video, it can be more problematic, and therefore we really do have to go back to this idea of sequential proximity and not having sequences too far apart where they're appearing on the screen that we're playing with. Of course, though, this can be a really effective design approach when it's appropriate for what you're trying to communicate. You might want to create a disorientating effect, and that's something that many music videos, where it's about impression rather than legibility, they use and play with this idea, so they won't actually conform to sequential proximity, or they may for key parts, but then they alter it in other sections. So again, it is very much this way of choreographing every bit of text as it appears, understanding what the purpose and intent of your communication is, not just in what is being said in that text, but the impression and the meaning that you're trying to convey and the effect you're trying to create on the viewer. So let's look at also this idea of grouping when we play with transition and direction. Importantly, it's possible to actually break away from strict directional proximity as long as the eye of the audience is allowed to follow a consistent path. And this is a really good example where we can actually start to have a bit more fun with the screen, but we're not actually working against legibility. So this idea of grouping elements is a good way of guiding the viewer through the different parts of a statement or a sentence. So let's look at this because it's quite an interesting approach. So there you have a series of really straightforward examples, but I think they all start to identify the different approaches you can apply. Again, it doesn't have to be kind of this free-form sort of approach that you take to designing the way that text appears. And even if you're just doing a very simple title sequence, it's worth looking at these different approaches because they really start to identify what's your intent by you considering which options to use, and you actually are starting to apply real design strategies. And that's what we're wanting you to do, not just kind of work from your gut feeling as you kind of create these storyboards and then you also then hop onto After Effects. We want you to kind of be able to conceptualize and understand what is an effective design strategy from a theoretical perspective. And that's what we want to see in your discussion of your works as well. So it would be worth looking back at this framework to understand, even if you kind of are quite improvising when you're kind of editing and playing with the text a little, go back and see why something might be working by looking at this theoretical framework and how it's accentuating the way that you want to communicate. So this is part one. In the second part, we're going to actually start playing with the idea or exploring the kind of design principles that exist when you've actually got image and sound in the mix. So we're starting to look at more complex works and how type operates in those contexts.